G'day, welcome to another episode of Sidekick TV. Today, we're actually joined by a couple of people. So we've got Richard Wheeler, who's a business partner of mine in our Timaru office, and Tom Simpson, who's joining us all the way from Sweden. Now, Richard and Tom know each other really well, so I'll hand over to Richard now to introduce Tom.
Yeah, g'day guys. Richard here. Just like to introduce Tom Simpson. He's an old mate of mine from Christchurch. We used to play a bit of footy together for high school old boys back in the day, and got up to a bit of mischief and won the odd championship together. He's been through the whole Christchurch experience. Got qualified and then gone over to Sweden and brought the pie revolution to Scandinavia, until he turned up, they didn't know what a pie was. So it'd be really interesting to hear about that story. And basically, and Sweden's actually managed things like COVID a wee bit differently than the rest of the world. So it'd be good to hear a bit about that too. So so Tom, tell us about your journey from Christchurch to Swedish pie innovator.
Yeah, hi, thanks Richard and Rick. Thanks for inviting me on. It's lovely to be here. So Richard and I played together at Old Boys in Christchurch, which is how we met. How did I end up in Sweden? Well, I went to Lincoln University and I did a food science degree and then honours, and I met my wife that I'm married to now there. This was 16 years ago. And we got married in New Zealand, lived together there for about 5 years before we decided to come over and try life in Sweden in 2011. And 2 kids later, and we started a business together in 2015. So that was how we ended up in Sweden, in Katrineholm, which is about 2 hours out of Stockholm.
Yeah. So
how do you get a pie company off the ground over there?
You want the short answer or the long answer, Richard?
The medium answer is fine. Just go for it.
Well, obviously, I think it's quite similar to any kind of a startup business where you're doing a new product or a new service in a new country. You kind of got to test and start. You've got your vision and your idea of what you want to create or what sort of service you want to provide, and then you got to go out there and test it and make your mistakes and learn your lessons, and then reiterate and try again and make more mistakes and alter and tweak and twist and reiterate and over and over and over and over and over again until you find a winning formula. It's a really short answer. We started off by we have our background as food scientists, so we've worked in the food industry, and I worked in a bakery in my family bakery when I was at high school and at uni part-time for a bit of cash, and so I had the background. I kind of knew how to do it on a small scale, and we subleased a kitchen which we had on the weekends, and we drew down some money on some small gear that we could transport to and from, and I had rebuilt my garage into a freezer storage for pies, and worked all weekend baking, and then spent the week after sort of selling them. And quite quickly we had customers in sort of Stockholm and Gothenburg and around Sweden, and we were exporting to Finland. So there'd be trucks driving down my street, like big freezer trucks driving around this little street in suburban Katrineholm. I'm like, what am I doing here? And then I'm like, I'll grab a pallet of pies, put it in the back of his truck, and he'd drive it off to Helsinki. So we sort of realized very quickly that we needed to get our own production facility and set up our own base.
It reminds me of, I was told years ago the story of, are you an optimistic salesperson or not? And I kind of think, you're selling pies in Sweden and they don't know what pies are. It's like this story of these 2 shoe salesmen, and they went over to the islands, and one of them just got there and instantly thought, this is ridiculous. I'm getting out of here. They don't have shoes here. But the other guy was like, this is amazing. No one has shoes here. You know, we can sell to everyone. Like, what made you think it was more of an opportunity that they didn't have pies rather than the fact that they did?
Yeah, well, that was always kind of my my attitude to it, was that they don't know what they haven't got, and trying to get them to understand the product. Was lucky that, because they have things they call pies here, and it's not like America. It's like a quiche is their standard pie, and I mean they're not wonderful. Anyone that's eaten lots of quiche will tell you that quiches, they're not pies in the real sense of the word. So that meant that it wasn't a foreign concept. It wasn't like I was saying to them, I've got these fermented sheep testicles that I want you to eat. That would have been a much harder sell. Whereas they were all curious about, oh, this new pie, New Zealand, and New Zealand has a very positive light, or people look positively on New Zealand as a country, and so I decided that the name should be New Zealand Pies from the start, and then it was the challenge of sort of, and it still is a challenge even today, is trying to say, we have a pie and it's not the quiche, it's a New Zealand style pie, and then explain and show them what that is and teach them to eat it. You know, people think that food is a simple concept. Anyone eats food, but the question is, like, how do you eat them? And it's like, well, you use your mouth most of the dinner. So yeah.
Yeah.
Have I answered your question?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's great.
So what, Tom, what scale are you at now? I mean, you've raised some capital over the last couple of years, and you know, you've been doing it several years. Where are you at with the business?
Yeah, so we started off 2015, and through 2016 we were baking at someone else's commercial kitchen, and then in the middle of 2016 we found a premises that was newly built and empty, and they started to rebuild that after our specifications, sort of towards the end of 2016. We started baking in the new bakery at the start of 2017, and then we quickly outgrew the first premises we had. It was just got too small really quickly, and luckily the building was really big, and we've taken over kind of half of it now. So we've got 800 squares, and we've got all that rebuilt. And so we've been constantly over the last 5 years, almost 5 years, upgrading everything and getting bigger kit, more plant, more staff. So it's been constant investment, and at the same time as building up a brand and investing in packaging and all that type of stuff. And so where are we at now? When we started off, we were selling most of our pies directly to end customer, and also had some customers sort of selling wholesale. But then over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, we've started selling more and more and more through supermarkets, retail, especially through COVID. The whole of the food service market, which is cafes and bars, just vanished. Literally over the course of a week, it went from all the bars and cafes that have been ordering and been going really good, all disappeared overnight. And so it was a bit shocking. Sort of dropped. We sort of lost $100,000 in turnover in the space of 6 weeks. That was April last year, 2020. So since then we've gone all in on retail, which was our long-term plan anyway, but it was kind of the nudge we needed, you know. So now we said, okay, we have to focus on this one market. That's what we always wanted to do. So we saw it as an opportunity. So now we're a centrally listed supplier with the biggest supermarket chain in Sweden, which is obviously since about a month ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we came into the essential distribution network. So we're just working and growing into that, because it's a non-centrally driven supermarket chain. So you still have to sell the products into the supermarkets and they order centrally, but then you've got to help them onboard the customer, get them selling. And it's a real education process. You know, you're going out and teaching them about the product, how to eat it, how to sell it, how to talk about it. Yeah, big job. And then, so that's just B2B. And then you've got the B2C side of it, which is even bigger, trying to get the people walking around the supermarkets to choose the products and try them. And so it's a big undertaking. So we're right in the middle of that at the moment.
Yeah. And going back to, you know, where you were just talking then, like April 2020, it was when most people's world kind of got turned upside down. But over here, we were led to believe that Sweden was just a free for all. There were no restrictions. It was almost business as usual. Was that the case? I mean, why did all the bars and restaurants just stop ordering overnight? What actually happened in Sweden that time?
Yeah, well, I'd say it was probably the same as fear was a big driver of everybody's reaction to the virus. No one knew what it was capable of and how deadly it was going to be, and all you were hearing was about Italy. You know, the full hospitals, you know, in terms of the ICUs are overloaded. And so Sweden kind of prides itself on being a very evidence-based, rational type of place. And so they didn't really understand what they were up against, obviously, but they didn't throw the whole kitchen sink at it from the first moment. They said, oh, we want to see what this is before we make a decision. It's obviously much harder to lock down at a place like Sweden than it is New Zealand or Australia, because we don't have sea borders. We've got land borders with Norway and Finland, and you can drive across from Denmark, and you know, there's a huge area that you can drive across the borders. So you can't just lock the place down. You've got people that commute to work, people that work in Norway and Denmark, and so you can't just lock down, because it's people wouldn't have accepted it here either in the same way as in New Zealand. So the idea was that it's always been based on a voluntary sort of at the start, which was in the first sort of 3 months of the pandemic, through the Swedish spring, March through to say June, was when quite a lot of damage got done. It got into the elderly care homes, and a lot of elderly people unfortunately got the virus and died. That was kind of, Sweden's a very, very, very well-traveled country too. People travel a lot with work and even leisure, especially in the spring. So there were apparently thousands of Swedes who were in Italy, in that real hot area around the Alps, around the time where it got in there and spread, and they all came back to Sweden, and we didn't even know that the virus was really around then. It was only just coming out, and people were still talking about it being a Chinese phenomenon then, but it was already in Stockholm. It was already circulating really early. So we kind of got taken a little bit unawares, while I think Asia, and especially Asia, were a lot more used to things like SARS virus, and very, 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 very aware of the risk of a pandemic. So New Zealand got good intelligence quite early, I suspect, and were able to act accordingly, and were able to sort of shut down. And early, we weren't able to do that here, and quite a lot of virus got in. The government, I suppose, made the judgment call that they didn't need to do mandatory lockdowns and keep kids out of school. They're always mindful of kids going to school, and you know, it's obviously very important here, education, quite rightly too, I believe. So no, they didn't lock down, but there was obviously a cost. I don't know how many thousand died in that first wave, but I think it was around half, and then that was a lot of elderly and a lot of people with predisposed health conditions. And then during the summer, with the warmer weather, like all viruses, the spread went down drastically. In summer 2020, July, August, September, October, there was no corona really. There was nobody in the intensive care departments. life as normal, essentially. They've always had these social distancing guidelines in terms of keeping 2 meters apart and how many people you're allowed to have in a certain area and the ventilation required. So trying to keep the spread down. Then the second wave came in the autumn of 2020, November. It really hit, and it was bad. And there was a lot of death through the winter, the cold winter of 2020, 2021. And there were really hard restrictions. So Sweden did change. If you were listening to the Swedish government and how they were talking about the virus, they did change their rhetoric quite drastically, and they had maximum. I think there was one person per table allowed in restaurants, and so we got 100 square meters in our little factory shop here, and we were only allowed to have 8 people in the whole area. It basically shut down a whole industry. So the hospitality died. If you go back to 2020, March, April, when the pandemic first hit, bars and cafes died because of fear. People were scared to go out. People weren't going out at all. So, and then it got better during the summer, and then when the second and third waves hit through the autumn and winter, with the restrictions that got put in place, you couldn't run a restaurant or a cafe without either losing money or running on the bare bones.
And what was the public perception at that time? I mean, was it quite segmented through society? Were the more senior people fearful, whereas young people wanted to get on with their lives, but there were these restrictions? Or was everyone quite happy and compliant about these restrictions?
I think overall the support's has been pretty strong from the population. People are pretty supportive in the fact that they've tried to keep things open. They haven't just shut everything. On the other hand, people obviously don't like seeing this, 15,000 fatalities. People don't like that number. It's not a fun number. So there have been very critical factions, and there's been a lot of debate around, should we have been harder? Should we have gone earlier? And that's understandable. It's a very difficult virus because of the fact that it can literally, you can get COVID, and if you're lucky, you don't even really get a symptom. And then you might not necessarily be 80 years old, and you might be 50, but it can kill you if you're unlucky. But obviously very unlucky, but so it really divides humans up, because some people don't get affected and some do, and humans are already quite divided animals anyway. So you end up with really, really polar viewpoints, and then it's very hard to get people to agree and work together.
What about the people that may have their lives extended because it hasn't been shut down? I mean, I heard a stat today over here, we're getting there's 9 undiagnosed breast cancer cases a day over here. So I mean, that all those other things, that unintended consequences that come from this, you talked about it earlier around outcomes from having lockdowns and restricting education on children and their future ability to generate income and care for their own future children and those sorts of things. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that what's happening now with what happened during the winter in New Zealand with the RSA virus, is it?
Yeah.
With the small babies, we're getting that here now. So that's a classic unintended consequence, that we haven't interacted very much, and there's been very little spread of germs. And now that we are interacting together again like we were before, there's a huge amount of the RSA virus going around, and small babies are getting really, really sick. So that's kind of the same thing. Yeah, we have the same phenomenon here. Fortunately, the hospital system here in Sweden is very well funded, and they did an absolute enormous job in like working for months and months with huge numbers of very, 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 very sick people. And they're the unsung heroes of this whole pandemic, are the people working in the hospital systems around the world. But as a consequence of that, obviously there have been people who probably haven't got elective surgeries, people that have needed hip replacements, knee replacements, cancer screening, all sorts of stuff, haven't had the same level of care that they would have got. And there will be consequences for that. It's unavoidable. And that's part of the Swedish. I think Sweden's approach. I mean, living in Europe, we've had pandemics since thousands of years back. If you can go back to the plague, and I suppose they tried to take a really, that's right. So they tried to take a view that they, looking long term, how's this going to be in 2 years, 3 years from now? And I think that's kind of been the problem, and that's the predicament that New Zealand's in now. Is you've handled it very well. I wouldn't say it's been a bad response. I wouldn't say that, but you're kind of struggling a wee bit now with like they didn't do a scenario. They didn't break down the scenarios and get this as a possible outcome, that the virus was going to get in anyway, and they're being forced to go from elimination to living with virus very, very, very quickly. And they're just sort of trying to work that out now. And they're doing a reasonable job. I was quite impressed. I was a bit worried that the government in New Zealand were going to dig their heels in on elimination and say, oh, we're going to beat this, we're just going to lock down and lock down and lock down. But so I'm glad that they've seen common sense and are trying to move. And
Hey, and that's a good point. With politics and algorithms and social media, I mean, it's very easy for us to get polarized into one camp or the other. But I mean, from your position on the other side of the world, looking in at New Zealand, how do you kind of see our political system, how it performs and that over a long period of time? What's your thoughts?
That's a very big question, Richard. I think in terms of the pandemic, I think most governments, most people would have made the very similar decisions to what the one did make. You'd hope. I think so fair enough. If I lived in an island and could isolate myself, I would have done the same thing. You're talking systemically, aren't you, in terms of how I view New Zealand as a society?
Yeah, just to provide some context, because we can get caught into the whole kind of left-right national Labour sort of thing. We've had MMP since 1996, but we're not quite Zimbabwe or Venezuela or North Korea just yet. Not just yet, if you know what I mean. It's not quite that bad. Or yeah.
No, I think New Zealand. It's funny. Sweden's kind of similar. Very quick to self-denigrate and say, so talk yourselves down. But from the outside looking in, Swedes see New Zealand in a very positive light, and so many Swedes that I talk to say New Zealand's the one country I can see myself living in instead of Sweden, because Swedes in turn are very, very, very proud of Sweden at the same time as they're very quick to talk smack about it. And say it's a bureaucracy and blah 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 blah. So it's very similar, because the way that I see it, New Zealand is very similar in that regard. But my interpretation is that Corona's been pretty good for New Zealand's image internationally, and that there's been a very steady, a very seemingly logical leadership that has taken good decisions, and the outcomes have been pretty good too. I mean, you have one death with Corona and there's like a national mourning ceremony, So it just goes to show that you haven't had much in the way of Corona related deaths yet. So when you've got 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 dying a day, you're not having memorials for one death.
So we're starting to get headlines now. It's going to be in our community by Christmas time. Well, Rick and I are in the South Island, so we're probably the last bastion in the world of potentially COVID-free society. I mean, it's probably already here, depending. You know, there's probably been a boat landed offshore or something's happened. Yeah, what's it like running a business now for you, now that you're 18 months on or 12 months on from this thing happening, and you've got to get up and go to work and feed your family and just carry on? How's it work?
My own personal opinion, throughout this, with the virus and how it spreads, and is that it's very weather dependent. So during our summers, the last 2 summers, life has been more or less very normal, in that you can be outside more too. So hospitality businesses can open up because they can have it outside, for example. Now we're back to normal again in Sweden, so they've taken away all of the restrictions. We've never had any mask mandate here, so it has only been mandates for public transport during the worst part of it, and not everyone even followed that mandate. I think it was quite slack. So this whole everyone wearing masks, that hasn't been a thing in Sweden. So for me, I can't really say that, apart from the first 2 months of the pandemic when we really were hit quite economically quite hard, there hasn't been an enormous effect on my daily life. I can't really say I've been affected, and that's because I haven't been locked down and I haven't had to wear masks and I haven't had guards telling me what to do and where to stand, and it's all been voluntary.
So that's really interesting, Tom. So I mean, you know, by the sounds of it, Sweden, you are just living with the virus, and although it's had a much higher mortality rate than more common flus, as a society, you've taken it in your stride. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. You have to be careful. There are a lot of people that scoff at the virus and just don't think it's a threat at all. So you should never take it for granted that you won't be badly affected by it. Statistically speaking, you're very unlikely, if you're younger and healthy, to be badly affected by it. That's fact. I don't know of any children who haven't had pre-existing health conditions that have been affected by the virus. They've had it in my kids' daycare when they were in daycare. Now they've opened school, but it's been in the school, it's been in the daycare centre, and no one's died. I have had a couple of customers, private customers, older people that have died. So one guy that used to come in, this was last year, it was his daughter that came in and said, "Oh, Dad died last week from corona." So I mean, yeah, so that's why it's so difficult, because not everybody's affected equally by it.
So what about vaccination rates over there? I mean, you guys are out of the blocks pretty quickly with your vaccinations compared to here. So you're vaccinated?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the population like? What's the uptake over in Sweden with vaccinations and boosters?
Well, they want more. They're always wanting more. I think in terms of full vaccination, it's about 66%, and then with one dose, it's like 88 or 89% that's had one dose. The part of the population that's resistant is very stubborn.
Yeah,
you'll find that everywhere. I think you find that in New Zealand too. The ones that don't want to vaccinate, it's very difficult to get them to do it.
But by the sounds of it, at the moment, that's a relatively low vaccination rate. I mean, 2/3 of people vaccinated. That's quite surprising that life goes on, and doesn't right now. I mean, lots of people have had probably the vaccine or the virus. And what are the daily cases like now?
I think that this has been a little bit. I think you need to look at the cases with a grain of salt. because if it's a whole lot of teenagers that have it who aren't sick without pre-existing health problems, it doesn't really matter if there's 100 cases in that group. Unless, of course, they go and hug their grandparents and give them COVID, because then that will have a very, very bad outcome. But I think you also have to look at the demographics of, I'm not sure about the demographics of it, but I can imagine that the vulnerable, the sick and the old are probably 95% fully vaccinated. I can imagine, or 99%. I don't know, but I think it's probably the less vulnerable who are more inclined not to be vaccinated, would be my suspicion, without having any numbers or any facts to go from. Yeah. What was the question again?
No, look, I can't remember. Your answer was really interesting, so it doesn't matter.
Well, Ricky, you're talking about it being 2/3 vaccination rate on average across Sweden is fairly low. But what Tommy was saying is he would imagine that it would be higher in the more vulnerable or elderly part of the population, that unverified, of course. But but as you're saying, life carries on. So, but yeah, so Tom, part of the team of 6 million, they're speaking on behalf of the 1 million Kiwis living offshore. 2 questions. How do you think, or what do you think where do we go to from here? And when do you think you'll be coming home for a visit?
Yeah, my feeling on, it feels a little bit like the media and the government in New Zealand are being a little bit propagandist, or driving a propaganda campaign to incite fear, which I can kind of understand, because you want people to take the threat seriously and follow orders. I understand that. At the same time, as I don't think that the picture they're painting is really reflected in reality if you look at places like Sweden. And I think that fear can also be paralyzing as well. So it's a fine balance. I think they need to be a little bit more open about the real threat to everyday New Zealand, because I don't think it's not equal. The threat for kids going to preschool is not the same for the people in the elderly care homes. It's not. That's just fact. They're not saying that though. They're making out that it's the same for everyone, and we all have to take it all extremely seriously and stay safe and all that type of thing. I hope they become a bit braver. That and to be cynical about it, it's probably dependent on what the electorate thinks and says. So if the electorate starts to say, we don't believe you anymore, Jacinda, and we don't want this anymore, you have to open up our society, and we have to open up our borders and move on. I think you find that Labour do that because they want to be re-elected. That's the way politicians think and work. So I hope that they are, yeah.
You're starting to see a few instances where you got church groups and sort of gangs pushing the envelope a bit, the boundaries a wee bit, and then you got the quite compliant part of the community sort of saying, well, it's not very fair, and starting to get a bit upset about it. So those are the sort of creeks of what you're talking about. Yeah. What's that? Sorry. Yeah.
I didn't answer your question about when I wanted to come home.
Yeah. When's that likely to happen?
I'll come home when you open the border, Jacinda.
And are you gonna have your 2 weeks in MIQ, or are you gonna self-isolate, or what's your conditions?
No, I'm not going to do 2 weeks in MIQ. I'm vaccinated. Why should I be doing MIQ for 2 weeks? And I'm not paying for it either. I mean, at the end of the day, life is so good here in Sweden that I don't have to rush home.
Yeah, but there's that little thing, just the little voice inside you, that feeling in your chest. You just need to get back here and experience it, don't you?
Oh, I don't know, Richard. It'll happen when it happens,
Yeah.
Well, you don't need to now. You've got pies in Sweden, so what are you coming home for, eh? You can just You can just stay over there. Hey, thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Tom. That was really, really enlightening to understand what's actually going on over there, because we kind of thought for a while that Sweden was the country to watch to see what's happened, and that's been really enlightening. So thank you so much for this, for taking the time. At probably quite an odd time of day over there as well. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Good to catch up, mate. We'll talk soon.
For sure. Cheers.